Nonpartisan forum on evictions and foreclosures, providing information on issues and resources. Of course, I need to make mention that today is the first opening arguments in the Chauvin trial for the murder of George Floyd and that Black Lives Matter. This forum was conceived of last November, December, and the date was a result of rescheduling for schedules. So we appreciate everyone participating tonight for what we think is a very important issue, that thousands of renters and homeowners face possible eviction or foreclosure when the COVID-19 protections end due to unpaid rent or mortgage forbearance agreements. As the state and federal executive order eviction protections and mortgage forbearance periods come to an end, renters and homeowners face potential eviction or home foreclosure. Our session tonight will discuss tenant and homeowner resources to address these risks. And of course, in today's news, we heard that the CDC protection has been extended for 90 days. That was ending March 31st. Our speakers tonight: Hennepin County Commissioner Irene Fernando, Hennepin County District 2. Commissioner Fernando was elected to the Hennepin County Board of Commissioners in November of 2018. Prior to joining the county board, Irene worked at Thrivent Financial, leading around organizational design, culture, and talent. And Commissioner Fernando holds a Master of Education in Youth Development Leadership, lives in the Harrison neighborhood in Senate District 59 with her partner Kent, and I'm jealous of your dog, Ernie. And I did want to make mention, Commissioner Fernando, that in your other bio, you said you learned to believe in what's possible growing up in a large Filipino family. And I was moved by your statement yesterday in the DFL AAPI meeting. And I feel empathy that you said from your mother, you learned the value of a strong work ethic, and every person has a story. And from your father, you learned how to strategize, ask questions, and find creative solutions, and that your nonprofit experience and leadership is extremely impressive with the Students Today Leaders Forever. Just amazing volunteer data. Second speaker, Mike Vraa, Managing Attorney and Hotline Director with Homeline. Mike is the Managing Attorney and Homeline Hotline Director at Homeline, where he has worked since 1996. Mike now runs the Tenant Hotline and has personally advised over 36,000 renters in his career. So as the Managing Attorney and Hotline Director, Homeline provides free legal, organizing, educational, and advocacy services to tenants so that they can solve their own rental housing problems. And again, amazing statistics. The hotline has taken over 260,000 calls since 1992 and averages 1,000 calls a month. Tenant advocates and attorneys have given over 2,000 speeches. And so they've prevented over 13,400 evictions and assisted over 7,100 renter families facing landlord foreclosure. Our third speaker, pleased to have State Representative Esther Agbaje, Senate District 59B. Esther is a former director of DFL SD 59, is now Vice Chair of the Rules and Legislative Administration Committee, and serves on Capital Investment, Housing Finance and Policy, Preventive Health Policy Division, and Taxes. Esther resides in Minneapolis, is an attorney, and has not only a Master of Public Administration from the University of Pennsylvania, but the Juris Doctorate from Harvard University, and was elected to the State House in 2020. And with that, I can post our agenda in the in the chat. We have a few questions, I think, that were sent in before the meeting. So opening remarks by panelists, approximately 5 to 10 minutes. So we'll take about 20 minutes for this segment, opening remarks from our panelists. And we can start with Commissioner Fernando.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Commissioner Irene Fernando, but you can call me Commish. I have the honor and pleasure of serving as Hennepin County Commissioner for District 2, which includes Plymouth, Medicine Lake, Golden Valley, North Minneapolis, Northeast Minneapolis, Bryn Mawr, and North Loop, as well as St. Anthony Village. Huge thanks to DFL leadership within Senate District 59 for planning this and for inviting me. Just as an opening, I'll put my contact information in the chat. I know that we're also streaming live, so hopefully someone can also paste that in there. I use she, her pronouns. I am the youngest woman elected to the Hennepin County Board. Alongside Commissioner Conley, we're the first commissioners of color in Hennepin's 170-year history. With Mandy Meissner, we're the first Asian Americans elected to county commissioner in the state, and I'm the first Filipino American elected in the state. I share that as a bit of an opening because whenever I speak with my title, I understand that its responsibilities originate from a time where I would have been considered subhuman by the law. And particularly as we think about the many, many, many ways we must be demanding and fighting for justice alongside the most vulnerable, I always feel a particular pull at the privilege, opportunity, and responsibility I hold by being in this position. And so I truly thank you for inviting me and look forward to ways we may be able to partner as we advocate for those who are marginalized and structurally disenfranchised. Specific to this event, I'd like to begin with a very simple value statement. I believe housing is a human right. Every single one of us deserves access to safe, permanent, and dignified affordable housing. I believe that rent and mortgage payments should have been canceled for the duration of the public health emergency. However, I do not have any authority to make that decision, although I did provide that feedback. I tried to impress that viewpoint because the elected leaders, particularly from the federal government, who could have made such a decision, the amount of political courage required is I hope not inaccessible to us. And so I hope and look forward to the ways by which we will continue to demand this type of really human-centered, compassionate approach should we face crises like we're facing today. The fact that we're facing an eviction and foreclosure crisis once the moratoriums are lifted is a direct result of this lack of political courage. Our systems have permitted not just imbalance, but have required a sense of exploitation in order for them to function. And that's why I'm labeling aspects of this political courage. Can we get enough people in the right positions to say aye at the right time? There are many facets to the housing needs in our community, even before the current public health emergency. Over 150,000 Hennepin households were spending more than 30% of their income towards housing. And 65 of these households spent more than half of their income towards housing. So again, this is prior to the pandemic. People right away are not able to house themselves and to do so in a way that really cares for themselves and for their families. Being this housing cost burden puts our neighbors at risk of being unable to afford other basic needs like healthcare, food, transportation, education. And in this current time frame, internet is actually treated as a commodity and not a utility. And internet has certainly been a requirement to deliver education, healthcare, and other basic needs. So the issue of unaffordable housing and evictions goes back decades, but like so many issues, has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Thousands of Minnesotans are struggling to pay rent as parts of their economy remain closed, and the looming possibility of all of these households being evicted is horrifying. Imagine the stress for each person, each child, and then also each system, as we are already strained. Our systems are already strained And to think of that type of influx on top of every single other thing that's occurring in our communities seems almost kind of insurmountable. And so in order to stabilize people in their housing and prevent disruptive, expensive evictions and foreclosures, I hope that the governments that we're a part of can collectively extend the eviction moratorium through the end of the year, allocate additional money to support rental assistance programs, and then allocate funding to partner organizations to guarantee a right to counsel for those facing eviction in court. And I certainly believe that language translation is not an add-on here, that is central. We must be serving our residents in a way that is meaningful to them. While I think these collective efforts need to be both bolder and broader, we do have some programs available. I know it doesn't meet the need. I'll put this in the chat too, but emergency rental assistance resources can be found, since I know that we're broadcasting, at hennepin.us/rent-help or by calling 612-348-6442. There's affordable housing options. I'll put that link in the chat. Emergency shelter via coordinated Henry for those who might be currently unhoused. And then for people fleeing domestic violence, I'll also put a link there. And so I'm sharing this knowing that this is more of a conversation than it is kind of a presentation. And I just really look forward to the ways that we will have dialogue this evening to ensure that all levels of government, and certainly that I am able to advocate and support the best that I can in this position. So yeah, that's what I have as my opening. Thanks, Jeff. You are muted, Jeff, if you're talking.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Commissioner Fernando. Next, let's hear from State Representative Esther Agbaje.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to everyone at SD 59 for putting this together. Again, I do want to send out my thoughts to everyone, especially on this first day of the Derek Chauvin trial, and to the community members who are, working through this. And so, but we are talking about housing, which is also another one of those areas where we still need justice, where we still need to ensure, as Commissioner Fernando said, that housing truly is a human right. That we are no longer putting people out on the street because they do not have access to money. So I'll just begin by, again, my name is Representative Esther Agbaje. I represent House District 59B, which is an area that covers downtown Minneapolis and the neighborhoods of Bryn Mawr, as well as near North, Harrison, and Willard Hay. And so these are neighborhoods that have a variety of types of housing in them. From condos, apartments, single family homes, duplexes. And we want to make sure that this housing is preserved and is stable for the long term. Because what we know about housing is that it is foundational. Children need it if we want them to succeed in school. So that way they know they have a place to sleep every night, place to come back to, and that they're not worried about what's going to happen at the end of the day. We know that parents and adults need it in order to have that stability to keep their jobs and also provide a way to continue to accumulate their income and possibly accumulate wealth. And we also know that having a stable place to live that's affordable is also good for our physical and our mental health. In fact, I actually did a panel on the intersection of mental health and housing a couple of weeks ago. And so I would encourage people to look back at that, a number of resources that were discussed there as well. And so one of the things I touched on briefly is that having that stability can lead to an increase in income or even an increase in wealth. What we also know is that many of our BIPOC communities, our Black and Brown neighbors, have been excluded from the housing market when it comes to purchasing a home. So one of the things that we need is also pathways to home ownership to make sure that people can start to accumulate that wealth for themselves and their children and future generations. What we know now is that there's up to about 60,000 renters across the state of Minnesota that have the money to be able to buy a home, but we don't have that affordable housing available in our market. And so that's something that we need to continue to work towards to make sure that everyone has access to that. And one of the other things I also want to talk about is public housing. So we talk a lot about renting, we talk a lot about home ownership, but I also really believe that one of the ways that we can get to making sure that we truly are doing housing for all is by investing in our public housing. We need to make sure that that is a dignified place for people to live, that all of it is up to code, it's up to standard, and make it a desirable place to live. So that way it's not only stigmatized to those who are low income who live in public housing. I think if we truly invest in our public housing, we can see a dramatic shift in the marketplace to be able to really afford that low income, affordable housing for many people, no matter where they are on the income spectrum. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight. At the state legislature, we do have a number of bills that are up to support people through the eviction moratoriums when they end, as well as we know that there's funding coming in from the federal government. And so happy to continue to talk more about those throughout this conversation. And I'll also drop in my information in the chat. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me further. Thank you.
Thank you, State Representative. Third speaker on our panel is Michael Vraa from Homeline.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Mike Vraa, managing attorney at Homeline, where I run a free tenant hotline that covers the entire state of Minnesota. As mentioned, we take about 1,000 calls per month, more these days, and have done that since 1996 when I started working at Homeline. As mentioned, we cover the entire state. I'm not an elected official, but I deal with evictions on a daily basis, and the eviction moratoriums I'm pretty well versed in because that's what we've been talking about for the last year. We all know that when the world changed, we had to politically change with it immediately. And so both at the federal and state level, there were eviction moratoriums put in place. This is unprecedented stuff. And at the federal level, we had what's called the CARES Act initially, later replaced by a CDC order that is still in effect, was renewed today, was the official announcement, through the end of June of this year. However, I'm less certain about the CDC's status. There's also a Court of Appeals decision that was issued today. It's not technically a decision, it was a decision not to decide a case based on a Tennessee district court case that ruled that the CDC moratorium wasn't statutorily permissible. This, in my mind, has always been the biggest vulnerability of the federal CDC order, which has been in place since September of last year, which banned all non-payment evictions throughout the United States. This was passed during President Trump's tenure. So this isn't something that's just a Democrat concept. This was passed then, an executive order, and then it was reinstituted January 1st, actually through Congress, and then signed by the president. And then once again extended by President Biden through March 31, when it was set to expire. Now it's been announced that it's going to be extended through June, the end of June this year. However, as I mentioned, there's a court challenge in Tennessee that I think is the best argument a landlord group, and there have been several challenges around the country. Many have failed by landlords. There have been 3 favorable rulings on the CDC order for landlords, though, one in Texas, one in Ohio, and the one in Tennessee, which was turned down by the Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals. They decided not to hear the case, arguing that the government wasn't likely to succeed on the merits, so they weren't going to stay that decision. And as mentioned, my concern about the CDC order is real. This is new information. This is a today ruling, and so advocates around the country are trying to figure out exactly what it means. But like I said, I think the CDC federal order is vulnerable, which means we might be relying on the state eviction moratorium, which is still in place. Not every state has this. Some states never had a state eviction moratorium, but Minnesota had one starting in March of last year. Well, how firm is that? Well, it lasts 30 days at a time. It's tied in time to the peacetime emergency declaration that we've all heard plenty about since last March. And April 14th is when the official peacetime emergency ends. The governor can reauthorize that for another 30 days. The legislature could end it, though, if both chambers vote to end it, or the governor decides not to renew it, or some court decides that it's not allowable, although the governor's executive orders have withstood court challenges to date. The eviction moratoriums are going to end. There's no question about that. The question is, what does it look like when it ends? We heard that there are a couple bills at the state legislature, which is true. One in the Senate, one in the House, very different approaches, both talking about adding some more exceptions to the eviction moratorium in Minnesota. And a question that we're asked frequently is how large this wave of evictions will be. And that's a very difficult question to answer. I've heard people talk about, oh, a third of the tenants in Minnesota are going to get evicted in the first year. There's about 600,000 to 700,000 renters in Minnesota, rental households that we know of. There's plenty of unlicensed places. Not every place requires a license. It's not known everywhere, but that's a decent guess, 600,000 to 700,000. So is that really possible that we'd have 200,000 evictions in a year? I think that's a high number. But if you listen to landlord advocates, they'll say that there's no wave coming, that most tenants are current on their rent. And that's partly true. It's not as bad as it could have been, certainly as bad as I think many of us were predicting when this all began. And as mentioned, rent was not canceled. Rent is still due. And so what's solved this, at least part of the way, is that money has come from the federal government. First, through the CARES Act, there's an additional $375 million that the state, it's already been approved. It's just a matter of figuring out how to disperse the money correctly. And that's going to help solve many of these problems, but not all of the problems. But the money will help, and there's more money that was authorized in the latest federal package, the $1.9 trillion package that President Biden and Congress got enacted. Normal times, 13,000 to 17,000 residential evictions are filed in Minnesota each year. There have been about 1,000 roughly filed since the pandemic hit. So 1/17 of a normal year. I think a very conservative estimate, if you opened up the eviction doors tomorrow, is that we'd have a normal year's worth of evictions bottled up. 16,000 roughly. Every month we go on, you'd add another 1,300 to 1,600 more cases. The real problem with that, other than the fact that evictions are bad all around, they cost landlords a lot of money. They cost tenants a great deal. It's not just that they might lose that home, but they'll also have an eviction on their record and struggle to find housing for years to come. But the real problem with that from a lawyer perspective, an officer of the court, somebody who represents tenants that are dealing with evictions all the time, is how can the state possibly manage to get through 16,000 evictions? Because when the doors open, landlords aren't going to wait. If they're going to file evictions, they're going to file evictions as soon as they can. So there's a real chance that we'll have a year's worth of evictions or more filed in a matter of days. And there are statutory requirements that evictions have to be heard within a certain amount of time. Those are partly relaxed through some legislation in place now during the pandemic, but it's not sure how long that will last. So a big concern isn't just that there's going to be evictions, but the evictions will be, well, there will be an attempt to make them as efficient as possible. And again, as somebody that represents tenants, I want to make sure that due process isn't something that's trampled in that efficiency goal. So I don't mean to depress folks with just where we are, but I thought I'd offer the mechanics. I will also put our website up. We are a free tenant hotline. There's no charge to either call us or email an attorney directly with a tenant question. Any renter in Minnesota will be happy to help.
Thank you, Mike. So if Conrad, if you want to add any other questions that you had sent from people registering.
Yeah, so I don't see any questions in the chat. I will go to Facebook and see there. But if people would like to raise their hands in Zoom, then they can unmute themselves and we can move forward from there.
I put a couple of questions in the chat, so let's take participants first, but then the panelists can see question 1 and 2, and I'll put question 3 and 4. I hope they can. So people in the meeting can just raise your hand, and then Conrad will unmute you.
So Jeff, you had said you had added a couple questions to the chat.
Yes. Weren't they showing?
Well, could we move forward with those questions then?
Oh, certainly. Okay, let's do that. So I know participants maybe addressed part of this in their remarks. From your perspectives as elected officials or a tenant housing advocate, what level of need will Minnesotans and SD 59 residents be facing once some of the protections afforded during the COVID-19 pandemic have been lifted?
I can go ahead and start to tackle that, and then Mike, it sounds like you might also have some additional information to add. I mean, I think that, the biggest need really is going to be just that support, not only of the court system to handle all those cases that may come through, but of the tenants who will be facing that. And we know that a lot of our tenants that do go through the court system do tend to be people who have lower incomes, may not necessarily have access to legal support, and may not have gotten their jobs back yet. And so I think that need is going to be really great. One of the things that I do want to continue the discussion on with Mike is about that eviction process reform. So I actually have a bill that was heard, and that actually goes through and looks at how the eviction process is done to try to kind of bring in some more of that due process, some more of that time, so that way tenants can have the opportunity, not only that they get notice that they might be evicted, but then there's additional notice of when they would be first due in court. And then from that first court appearance, instead of having to be ready for trial that day like it is now, that could then allow them an additional 10 days to prepare for trial, or at least 10 days to prepare for trial, if not more. And so those are the types of things that we're discussing at the State House as to see, where and how we can make changes to the eviction process. And then I think another big one too is the expungements of evictions. So one of the things that happens in Minnesota is that once a landlord files an eviction for you, that then shows up on your record. And regardless of what the outcome of that case is, whether it was adjudicated and you were evicted, or it was dismissed or settled, or you moved out and the whole thing in your mind has gone away, it still shows up as a record, and it can still follow a person, and they may not even realize that they have such such an event on their record that could prevent them from seeking rental housing in the future. So there's a number of bills up on the House of Representatives side to address that, to try to make expungements happen either automatically, or at least make the evictions a non-public record until there's actually an adjudication. So I think those are some of the things that can help the need that is going to be there once these eviction moratoriums are finally done.
Thanks, Representative. I see we have someone with a hand raised in the audience. So let's go to Joe Mullery.
Am I okay? Thanks. I have 3 questions. Number one, I know a lot of seniors who, after they retire, in order to supplement their Social Security, bought a duplex and were relying on that. If they're not getting any rental income and they don't have enough to pay the mortgage, how are they protected? Second question is there, or why not, with regard to the moratorium on evictions, something looking at whether or not they have income? In other words, should somebody be able to stay in a property for a year or 2 without paying if they really have the same income coming in or close to it? And then the third one is, if there really is a huge number of evictions coming, why would anyone evict somebody that would, if there's a lot of them being evicted, then there's just a whole lot of empty spots, and you would, if as a landlord, you'd just be probably getting somebody else that's been evicted someplace else. And if you've had a person that was paying regularly until they lost their job during COVID, wouldn't they be a better risk than somebody who was evicted someplace else? So there's 3 questions.
I can try to address them unless Commissioner, you
Yeah.
want to take a shot.
I wasn't sure if some of this if Mike wanted to jump in. I'll address some of this as well as the previous one. So I just want to first begin that while we're talking about a lot of different aspects of the housing situation, this is about housing. This is about housing stability. This is about individuals who are currently in a place that they are deeming safe, comfortable, dignified, and for various reasons are feeling like that stability is at risk. That at any moment, something might pop up where it won't break in their favor. And that amount of stress, the mental load, as Representative said earlier, with children and mental health and jobs. And so I think it's especially with elected officials present, it's kind of easy for us to get to the policy aspects, but I just want to really center us on who is being impacted. And this isn't a situation where the paperwork is filed and once it's complete, then you are removed from your home. That's not what we're discussing here. In eviction, it can be really traumatizing. It could be a uniformed officer, often the sheriff deputy, banging on a door with a piece of paper, entering a home. And so I just like, there is a traumatic mental load every time we say the word eviction. And we have the charts and the data, and we'll get into that too, but I just want to, particularly for those who may have experienced housing instability of this type, or further have experienced a really traumatizing event in the name of your own safety. You know, and that's what's so harmful about what's taking place right now. For much of the pandemic, the medical order was to stay at home. And yet we still have story after story where that medical order was not being honored. So I want to begin centering with who is experiencing the greatest amount of harm interpersonally and institutionally. With respect to the types of needs that are coming forward, you know, there's a lot to discuss here. To Joe's first question around duplexes, I opened with saying that rent and mortgage should have been canceled. I agree with you that there's a little bit of this cascading impact. Hennepin was doing a tenant-based landlord program, for example, for a while, where we were saying landlords can apply on behalf of their tenants. So I mean, you are correct that there needs to be a way to see all of the people who are being impacted by this decision, by the conditions that are being presented, including you were outlining seniors or anyone who might be in this type of scenario. When we talk about the types of needs that will be appearing once these protections are lifted, I think it kind of depends on what you believe. If you believe that people were all generally taken care of, then that the last 12 months is the exception, that's a different question than the belief that I happen to hold, which is that inequities have been institutionally present, and certainly in Senate District 59. The disparities in SD 59 are astounding. They're devastating, along lines of race, along lines of wealth, along lines of basic rights. And so, you know, where people are even receiving their food, I wonder sometimes. You know, SD 59 is not just North Minneapolis, but 4 wards, 4 and 5 in Minneapolis, where I happen to live. 2 full city wards, 80,000 plus residents don't have a place to eat dinner. There's not one dinner location in these 2 wards. Imagine anywhere else in the state where we would have density of 80,000 residents in this small of an area and not have a place to eat dinner in the evening. And so I think that the needs coming out of this are going to be remarkable. Unemployment insurance really only gets at if you had a job that was on the books, that was seen in the eyes of the government. There's a lot of informal economy that occurs in multi-generational, multi-family households, a lot of informal economy that occurs in places that have been disinvested in and don't have the same resources other places. So I think the need is going to be remarkable. It may be devastating, and I hope that many of us are willing to act kind of in favor of, again, the communities who've been marginalized and disenfranchised for decades, at times centuries. And then with respect to the huge number of evictions, I don't know, this is why I was wondering if Michael was going to have an answer. I don't believe that landlords are acting in mass, right? It's not like one landlord mine across the state. Everyone will be filing their paperwork as fast as humanly possible. I think I agree with Michael's comment that perhaps a year's worth of evictions can occur in days. I didn't know the data that you had. My math says 156,000 to 204,000 evictions and is a year's worth of evictions. Is that what you meant? I couldn't tell the math.
No, it's somewhere between 13 and 17,000 evictions in Minnesota, a non-pandemic year. I was talking about the theory. Some people have been guessing that about a third of renters in Minnesota will be evicted within a year of the moratorium getting lifted. So that was where that number came from. Yeah.
My apologies. Regardless.
Estimate though, yeah.
Yeah, regardless, just to my last comment on Joe's last question. I don't believe that landlords are acting in mass. It isn't like one mind. And so whether or not it logically makes sense in the broader systems of it, people are feeling strained and people are in crisis, and the types of logic and decision making that occurs in that frame of mind may be distinct than what we might be seeing systemically, which is why I believe we need to be really, really centering those who are most vulnerable. So that's a wandering set of answers for a lot of questions.
And if I could jump in, I apologize, my internet cut out for a minute, so I didn't catch the last part of Joe's third question, but I'll take a second part, which is, I think, was there an income test that the tenant has been, I guess, trying to pay their rent or doing what they could? The state moratorium doesn't require that. It encourages tenants to pay their rent, but it doesn't have some sort of means testing happening. The CDC moratorium does. There's an income cap, $99,000 per adult, $200,000 per family. And you have to prepare a declaration as the tenant stating that you've done what you could to try to qualify for financial assistance, that you've been impacted by COVID. That's not required in the state moratorium, though. So are there tenants out there that had the money but didn't pay the landlord because they figured that the government would come in to save them at the end of the day? Sure, I'm sure that there are. But somewhere, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 80 and 86% of Minnesota renters are current on their rent. And so most people are trying to pay what they can pay. They're not just dodging this because they think that this is a free ticket for them. It seems like the ones that aren't paying are the ones that simply can't. They lost their job because they worked in a line of work that, beginning last March was no longer feasible. And so it's not like that employee didn't show up for work or showed up for work drunk all the time. The job just couldn't exist anymore. And so there is an analysis that we're taking societally here. And again, as I'll point out, this was touted as a nonpartisan approach. There have been Republicans and Democrats throughout the country that have talked about throwing giant vats of money at solving this problem. And that's, again, why the rent percentages in Minnesota are as high as they are, because there's been a lot of money that has been recognized as, hey, this is an unprecedented issue. And people are asking us how many evictions there are going to be. The only right answer is we don't know. We don't know. We can't know. This is not something you can look in the old playbook and figure out how it's going to go from here. The unemployment is still way too high. And even if people are employed, maybe it's partial. As far as, somebody that bought a duplex. So what you're talking about is what I always refer to as a mom and pop or even an amateur landlord. And I don't mean that as an insult. An amateur landlord is different from a professional. Professional landlord is somebody that's really a career for them. You'll see a lot of landlords that will buy an investment property or inherit a duplex or something like that. But at some point, if you have 10 units or more, you start to realize I don't have time to do that, plus my other job. Those are the professional landlords. But these amateur or mom and pop landlords that are just feeling steamrolled by this, and this is a giant percentage of their income that they're counting on, this federal money's, I mean, we're talking about how it's helping tenants, but it's going to landlords. That's what it's designed to do. It's designed to get to landlords to settle up the tenant's bill. And so right now, I mean, a bank can't really foreclose in Minnesota because the final step in a foreclosure is an eviction, and they can't go that far. And so if that landlord can hold on, then they'll ultimately, hopefully, get paid by the federal government as the money gets routed through to them. Why would a landlord evict, or will a landlord really run down to the courthouse the first day they can? Well, we've seen around the country a couple places where evictions were banned briefly, and then there was a time where it was reopened. I believe it was Pennsylvania, where they had about a 5-day window where the state moratorium had ended, but the federal moratorium was set to begin. It had been announced, but it hadn't begun. And it was like concert tickets for a concert that everybody wants to see, but nobody can see, and the line outside the building. And we've heard about evictions being set up in convention centers around the country because courthouses just aren't big enough. So when I say that I think that landlords are going to go file the eviction on the first day, it's based on what we're seeing empirically around the country, that if you got a landlord that's upset, I haven't been paid for a year, and they're told I can go file, and they don't think they're ever going to get paid by the government or by the tenant themselves, there's not much of an incentive for them to wait. And so there is going to be a rush of evictions. That's the one thing that I'm almost certain of, is that it's going to be very front loaded.
Thanks, Mike. We'll go to another question. I want to just throw in one other sort of factoid. From the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund February monthly survey of impacts, they identified $180 million cumulative rent unpaid from March 2020 to January 21. Their survey covered 31,561 units, 61% which were units covered by some form of rental assistance. And Minnesota data of that 180 million statewide, affecting about 40,000 renters, I believe. And rental units in Hennepin County, of which we are a part, I had 187,587 in Hennepin County. So moving to Peggy Clark. Did you want me to read your question, or did you want to read your question?
Here, I'm trying to get used to these. The talking on the Zoom, I usually don't, but you know, I have experienced housing insecurity and been homeless before and had to sleep in my car. So I'm well aware of what devastation can be created in your life as a result of something like this. And so I'm just wondering what resources from the various agencies like Hennepin County and the housing people and stuff like that, what can be done to disseminate to the renters that may be faced with eviction that can help them understand where they're at in the process and what they may be able to do to get themselves out of the potential situation they may be in. Because I know that they know that they haven't been able to pay the rent. I know that they're freaking out. I know that they're worried. They're probably not sleeping at night. And it's probably so overwhelming that they don't even know what to do or where to turn or what to do next. So where are possible entry points to be able to get the potential victims, I'm going to call them victims of eviction, resources that they need to dig themselves out?
Thanks for the question, Peggy, and for sharing a bit of your personal story. So Hennepin does have, the front-facing staff, the phone numbers, et cetera. But I think part of what you're getting at is people in crisis need to be able to trust government in disseminating this information. And so Hennepin, over the last couple of years, has really increased its partner organizations. People need to trust the information that is coming from the government, and therefore they first need to trust who they're receiving that information from. And so over the last couple of years, and especially during the pandemic, we really increased the contracts we had with community-based organizations, because those are the entities that are in partnership with people who are in need. As you outlined, a lot of times people are in need or in this type of crisis and are not sharing it. I mean, this isn't, you know, I think, I don't know what image people might have, but for a lot of people, they're trying really hard to pay their rent. They're trying really hard to pay their debts. They're trying really hard to make it to work after the 2 buses at 4 a.m., you know? And so there's honestly a bit of interpersonal aspects of this that we need to work through, the potential emotional aspects and maybe the shame or the guilt in needing to request for help. And we can only do that in trusting relationships. That isn't just, you know, an Instagram ad or flashing a number. It's really how can people feel like they're in relationship with the individuals who are expressing the resources. So I think that's kind of one aspect of what you're discussing, that so our, you know, Hennepin is increasing its resources, it's the ways by which we are engaging with residents, but we're also needing to really partner with people meaningfully and organizations meaningfully, so that they are in partnership with those who may be in need. The last thing that I'll say here is it's all interconnected. You know, all of what we're discussing is based off of income levels that not everyone has enjoyed. And even if households have been able to enjoy some of these income levels, they certainly haven't this past year. And so without really significant income equality discussions, in many ways, we will always be a little bit kind of behind. The Department of Economic, DEED, their cost of living calculator says something like $19.98 is what's needed for a minimum wage in Hennepin, and that excludes internet. So the basic needs hourly wage for an average family in Hennepin is $20 an hour. And we know that's not the minimum wages that are here. And that presumes full-time wage. And that doesn't take into account the benefits cliff and a whole other host of interconnected issues. And so we need to meet people where they're at in the languages that they are confident in, with people of whom they already trust, pairing with compassionate and holistic resources from government. And then on the highest levels, and this is why it's great to see Esther here, we need to be systems interconnected about it and really see all the ways in which one particular decision might be cascading into others.
I just want to follow on one thing, which is there not a way to find out who the people are that are going to be affected by this? Do we have, I mean, I know there's landlord associations and things like that. Is there any way to find out who those people are that are at risk of eviction and be able to specifically send some people their way to talk to them about their situation and be able to help them figure out a way to navigate the system? Because at this point, we rely on announcing things and we expect people to somehow find out about it and come to see us, the government, shall we say. But I think the opposite needs to happen, because I don't know that the people that are at risk are always capable of finding the resources they need.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Our office actually sends a letter to everyone in the state currently that has an eviction filed against them. These are court records, they're public records, and we send out a letter saying, hey, there was an eviction filed against you. We have attorneys that work on staff, and if you have a question, we'll be happy to try to answer what we can for you and find resources that might be available and see what your options might be in the eviction. But it's almost too late at that point. Once the eviction has been filed, there's only so much you can do. And Peggy, you bring up some interesting points, the tension that people have, the concept that they'll sort of put the issue off because they just don't know how to solve it. I can't tell you how many times in my career I've talked to somebody on the phone, and this is the first time they called anybody, and they're in the hallway of the courthouse of an eviction because it's suddenly real to them, and they didn't know what else to do. And it was just too much for them to even think about how to try to solve it because it seems so unsolvable. And in the hallway of the courthouse, I can give them some tips about what might happen in the courtroom, but it's a lot less than I could have done if they would have called me 3 days before or a week before. And so it's trying to reach those folks, and it's not easy because our eviction system, we heard from Representative Agbaje earlier that we're trying to, at the legislative level, they're trying to change the eviction process. Our eviction process was more or less, if you look back at its origin story, pre-Civil War, when Minnesota was a territory. It hasn't changed meaningfully since then. It's the same concept. We're one of only 7 or 8 states that doesn't require a landlord to even give a notice before filing an eviction. They don't even have to try. There's no requirement at all. I mean, if you were devising an eviction process system from scratch today, let's say you're Washington, D.C., and as part of becoming a state, you have to come up with an eviction system because you're a new state now. There's no way you would use Minnesota's system. There's just no way anybody would say that's what we want, because what we've done is we've created an eviction underclass. That's what our system has done. It has created this group of people, group of households, 15 to 17,000 a year that have an eviction on their record, which means a giant chunk of the housing options are no longer on the table for them meaningfully for about 7 years. And so changing the system would be wonderful. And I can say one other thing about the tension level that folks have. Our office has taken calls since 1992, and I've been here since 1996. I can say with a lot of confidence that typical calls pre-pandemic, on average, from the time we took the call to the time we put all the information in our database, it was about a half an hour of time per caller, per staff time. Within the last year of the pandemic, it's been much closer to an hour. We've nearly doubled the time. People are incredibly terrified. The rules are changing all the time. Important rules change today. And they're meaningful rules that really matter for millions of people. And they changed at really the stroke of a pen. And that's what we've been dealing with. And so it's very justifiable for somebody thinking, I'm not really sure I know what the rules are. I mean, if you look up the state statutes, they're not going to do you a lot of good to try to understand what's going on. You almost have to be following along social media just to keep up with what's current. And the Attorney General's office, for instance, publishes a landlord-tenant law handbook, practically meaningless the last year because they just can't keep up with it. So people are very justified in being concerned about making sure they know what the rules are and trying to follow them. It's a difficult time to grasp this stuff because it changes a lot and it's complicated.
Thanks,
I'll
Mike.
just say one last thing before we move on to the next question. Peggy, I think your question actually really hits on some of these changes that I think, me and the commissioner and a number of other like-minded people in our government now really want to do that work to make sure that we're bringing information to the people. So I saw in your write-up, you said, can we go to barbershops? Can we go to, parks? Can we go, wherever, like where people are? I think that that's something to continue to keep asking our agencies, or actually provide that funding for our agencies to be able to do that external outreach in a way that is coming to where people are, that's giving them the information, and similar to like what Homeline does, and they call everyone who has an eviction on it. I think, we should also be looking at ways that maybe we can put this information in every single apartment building that there is that we know of. So I think there's a lot of creative ways that we can, do things like that, and creative ways that we can use the resources that will be coming down from the federal government to make sure that people have that information.
Let's go to Jonathan Raylander next from across the river.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Jeff. So from what I'm gathering, and please correct me if I'm not hearing this correctly, Minnesota is one of those states where landlords are not required to give notice prior to eviction. Is that correct?
That is correct. If the rent is due on the 1st, the landlord can literally go file an eviction on the 2nd. That's the rule in Minnesota.
So given the circumstances, and obviously we're talking about extraordinary circumstances that we're going through at the moment, couldn't that be something that's mandated through executive order, either at the state level or at the federal level, that landlords must be required to give a 30-day notice prior to eviction?
Well, the CARES Act, interestingly, had a 30-day notice requirement in it. That, as they say in legislative speak, sunsetted in July of last year. That was the federal rule. It had a 30-day notice requirement if the landlord was covered by the CARES Act, which required a mortgage by a certain backing or some sort of federal subsidy involved. But I don't think it's likely that there's going to be any federal rule that requires notice at the state level, because it probably presumes that, and correctly so, that most states have a notice requirement already. Again, Minnesota, their lack of the notice requirement is really, it's going to be very problematic when they do open the doors, for sure.
Okay, so is that something though that would be within Governor Walz's power to mandate just that kind of a notice?
I think that the governor could do that in an executive order, but Representative Agbaje might want to talk about at least the House file that's proposed on how it would do the off-ramp, as it's called.
Yeah. So there's a couple of bills that are already, focused on that. Yes, I think the governor could make an executive order to that effect. The question is, the executive orders have gotten very contentious over this past year, so I'm not entirely sure that that is something him or his staff may be interested in wading into that, especially because there's at least 4 or 5 bills that actually have notice requirements in them should they get passed, and I'm very hopeful that something will happen with some of them. So the very first bill actually that was introduced into the session this year from the House side has a notice requirement in there of 30 days. There's also the off-ramp bill that Michael just spoke about. That would say that once the eviction moratorium has been lifted, for at least 1 year afterwards, a landlord would have to give 60 days notice to a tenant before eviction. And then we also have just another House file that's very specific to that, saying that there would at least need to be, I believe that one is actually just a 14-day notice, not a 30-day notice. So we're trying to, hit this from all sides to really make sure that as we go into the last part of session, which is mostly a negotiation process, that hopefully the notice happens. We know that in the Senate, that's not necessarily something they're willing to take up, but we've got at least 3, maybe 4 bills that have notice in them. And so I'm hoping that that becomes a strong negotiation point for us to stand on.
That's, I guess, why I'm most concerned, or the focus of my question is mostly on the executive, because given that the House and the Senate are so partisanly divided, is an executive action the way the most, not only the most expedient, but the most likely to be able to get done?
Well, it would be the most likely to put it in place the soonest, but that would also expire once the emergency runs out as well. So it would only be a temporary solution. And I think the additional considerations from the governor's office, I think, is just the additional considerations they make when they are doing their executive orders, because the executive order already for Minnesota to uphold the eviction moratorium in the first place they've already done an updated order that leaves in the specific circumstances in which a landlord can still move forward with an eviction. So I think there's just a lot in the political tea leaves about when and how the governor would use an executive order.
Thank you, State Representative. Time check, 7:30. So thank you, Jonathan. So just kind of quickly rapid fire going through the other questions. So did I hear $50 billion with a B in the American Rescue Plan Act coming out, across the country? I don't know the Minnesota allocation, but $50 billion for rental assistance. Maybe.
That might be. I actually haven't heard the number. I know the number coming to the whole country is supposed to be huge. I haven't heard the number coming to the state yet. But I do want to say on that option, and I'll put this link in the chat too, Minnesota Housing is expecting another huge infusion of cash for rental assistance, and also to go to the landlords too. And they're actually having 2 open house or information sessions, one tomorrow night and one Wednesday night. So I can put that link in the chat to also put on Facebook too.
Excellent. Before we take other audience questions, questions 3 and 4 that were put in the chat earlier. So recognizing that there were existing racial housing disparities long before COVID-19, historic, and in addition, disparate health impacts from COVID-19 for BIPOC communities of color, are there some identified areas of need requiring strategic intervention to rectify those dual impacts on housing going forward? And then 4th was like building back better using an equity lens so that longstanding historic racial housing disparities will be addressed in a reparative manner.
Yeah, sure, I could start. So first off, yes, this is all correct. I mean, last June, Commissioner Angela Conley and I were able to pass racism as a public health crisis in Hennepin County. And why that is important is because in addition to Angela and myself being the first and only commissioners of color in Hennepin's history, where we hold over 25% of the state's population, race had not been really a common topic from our policy position standpoint. So to have a policy position, if you will, that declares racism as a public health crisis, from that standpoint, we've been able to really integrate the disparities in general, but certainly along lines of race that are occurring across Hennepin when it comes to housing and affordability of housing, income, the accumulation of wealth, access to transportation and transit infrastructure. And then, of course, a big reason why low wealth communities and communities of color have been so historically disinvested in is, as you outline, racial covenants. I mean, I think what part of what this is getting at is redlining. So when 50, 60 plus years ago, there was a legal practice to say, based off of your country of origin, your ethnicity, your race, you cannot live here. From that, we see now, decades later, how valuation is really heightened for places that were historically for higher wealth or white households, and then valuations are lower for areas that have been redlined, have been stated as not accessible, not available to because of race. Why is that important? Well, because all of our government systems are based off of valuation and taxes. So think of year after year, decade after decade, certain schools, certain road infrastructure, certain projects receiving a different type of attention or care in other parts of the community versus certainly I can at least speak for North Minneapolis, which is a good portion of Senate District 59. So when we talk about an equity lens, I agree with you. The county was able to pass a disavowing of these discriminatory racial covenants in our housing deeds. And my intention, particularly for the Blue Line extension, is to quantify that historic disinvestment and ensure that that gets added on top of the forthcoming economic investment that should be coming with future projects. So there are aspects like that that governing bodies like Hennepin can take on. It does not repair the decades and centuries of harm. It just cannot, will not, does not. And so I hope there are broader conversations to discuss what that may mean. I'm a huge supporter of how we can be really creative. There are a lot of income-based, universal basic income like tests that are happening all across the country right now in different jurisdictions, including in St. Paul. I hope that there is a body of knowledge that comes from that we can be considering with our residents and with our our partners in other aspects of government. And so equity really should mean going back far enough that it isn't just equity in the last year, last 2 years, or last 5 years. We should be thinking about all of the ways in which policy has decimated certain communities over others, and therefore how can policy work to correct some of that harm? A lot of the harms we're talking about have resulted in death. We cannot bring people back. And I say that with a lot of heaviness about what's happening in our community, and heaviness with who is being impacted by this crisis. Not only who is dying at greater rates from the disease, but who's dying at greater rates because of their jobs. Essential workers, people making $8 an hour, $7 an hour, healthcare workers. And so I am hopeful, these questions are talking about essentially, can we take an eyes wide open and really get to some root cause? I hope so. I believe we have people on this call and people around our community who are willing to ask the types of difficult questions necessary. And I certainly am hopeful that we will collectively and hopefully gladly accept the discomfort that some of those answers may produce to create a vibrancy for all in our communities.
Thank you, Commissioner. I see we have Kathleen. You have to unmute.
Yeah, Commissioner Fernando, very well said. I completely agree with you. And I was thinking, what can we do at the state versus the federal level? Obviously, at the federal level, it's tax policy, it's healthcare, it's providing parental leave, all the things that we need for a safety net for families. But what can we do at the state level to repair some of that harm, to help people with home ownership, to provide childcare, to provide jobs? And so thinking about what the state can do versus what the federal government needs to do. And obviously we need to create an underlying system where, like you said, housing is a right and people have access to housing without struggling, and people are living paycheck to paycheck, and that's not okay. People are suffering.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. I mean, I think at the state level, it's a lot of similar actions actually to the federal government, of making sure that our tax-based structure is one that incentivizes home ownership and incentivizes particularly people who haven't had access to buying their first home yet, and providing that support, whether it's through funding to make sure that they can keep up with their homes, so that way their homes continue to increase in value over time. I think it's part of ensuring that we are providing options for our healthcare. We have a Minnesota care system in Minnesota, and we know that there's been disparities in healthcare, particularly on racial lines. So making sure that everyone has access to healthcare. The same with making sure that everyone can get a living wage job. These are the types of policies and programs that we can put in at the state level to support Minnesotans, and particularly to support our Minnesotans of color who have historically been excluded from a lot of the policies that Minnesota has made over the years. So I do think the commissioner is right that the same way that we had policies in the past that harmed us, it is now time to step up and create policies that support the communities that we say that we want to uplift.
And I'll mention that at the state level, that's where landlord-tenant law really is created. National laws have very little impact generally on landlord-tenant law. We're seeing the rise of city laws actually happening now. Minneapolis and St. Paul at the 4, St. Louis Park actually is the only city in the state that requires a notice to be given before an eviction can be filed now, with a city ordinance that took effect the 1st of this last month. Cities are doing this largely because the state level does have the gridlock that we've heard mentioned a couple times tonight. But moving something forward at the state law level would be the most impactful when it comes to landlord-tenant rules.
Thanks, Mike. Well, I think we're looking at the time here. We should move to our agenda closing statements or closing comments from the presenters. And We can either go in the same order as opening, or we can reverse it and start with Mike. Throw you for a loop there. So we'll, unless there are any final questions from participants, or Conrad, do we have any viewer questions?
Just checking right now.
Okay. I'm sure we can pick those up. So let's make sure you get the final word. Do we go reverse from the beginning? We'll start with Mike.
Sure, I can go.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining tonight and asking these insightful and good questions. They're the ones that matter for sure. Again, we all know that this is coming. There's this storm coming. The size of it is debatable. The immediate impact of it, I suppose, can be debated to some level, the long-lasting impact, but it is coming. And it's a matter of whether we can prepare for it thoughtfully. A question was asked earlier, why doesn't the governor just issue an executive order to do something? And Representative Agbaje's answer was, I think, very spot on, which was the governor's executive orders are going to end at some point. And at some point, the legislation has to be what is holding things up and holding things together. And so it's going to take some meaningful agreement at the state level, almost certainly, to create an eviction off-ramp that is hopefully palatable for landlords and palatable for tenants. Obviously, the governor could stand his ground and just keep going with the peacetime emergency declarations until a court stops it, or the House, also controlled by Democrats, just like the governor being a Democrat, would vote to strip the governor of the ability to continue with the peacetime emergency. And so far, the House has not allowed that. But at some point, the House may feel enough pressure from their constituents around the state, House members individually, to vote to end the peacetime emergency. So we do need some meaningful legislation. What I think would be the worst possible outcome for Minnesota is if all the eviction moratoriums went away with no plan for what's next. We need a plan for what's next. It needs to be thought through. The Senate and the House bills actually have some similarities to them. There is some common ground that could be found there. And so, although I'm not at that level, I'm not an elected official, I don't have a vote in one of those very important chairs. I think there is enough of a groundwork for a compromise to be perhaps reached, to at least make this an off-ramp and not just one giant cliff that we see pop up. So that is my hope going forward.
Well, I just want to say again, thank you to everyone who joined us in the Zoom room and who was watching online and who may watch this online later. I hope our discussion was helpful to you and spurs you to get the help you need if you so need it. You know, this is such an important issue, particularly in this district. And I just really want to say that, you know, there's so much work happening at the city level, the county level, the state level, to really ensure that we are either supplying the housing or making sure that there's rental assistance available for people. And I just want to really commend a lot of that work that's being done, and knowing that there's still much more to do. So, moving forward, as always, I'm committed to that fight, committed to that work, to making sure that we really can wake up one day and know that housing is a fundamental human right that's not being infringed upon for people. And I know that my Senate district counterparts, Representative Lee on the A side and Senator Bobby Joe Champion, feel the same way, and are working hard in their respective areas to ensure that our state government is keeping up with its promise to make sure that we are providing housing for people. So again, I'll just reiterate that, yes, the eviction moratoriums will end at some date and time. We don't really know when that is, but I would think that as the vaccines become more prominent, there'll be a lot more pressure for that. And so I hope that people will use this time, reach out, ask questions, so that way the resources that are bound can help you get to what you need. So thanks everybody so much.
Yes, thanks everyone for being here. Of course, thank you. Representative Agbaje and I have gotten to know each other the last several months or year, and it really is just very, very exciting to have you at the state and to know that your systems mind and the way in which you are seeking to really embed compassion at the state. I truly, if anyone has not, virtual hearings are a thing now. And so I have not attended a lot of hearings previously, but I have now in this virtual world. And it is truly, truly, truly incredible how a bill becomes a law. I mean, I actually haven't fully seen it yet, but I just can't thank you for the work that you're doing enough. And of course, Michael and Homeline for what you're doing across the state. My closing thoughts are this idea that it really is about the policies. We have to embed compassion in our leadership, and the risk of mass evictions and foreclosures we're facing is a result of decades of policy at every single level that did not center working class people, Black people, Indigenous people, or people of color. So this problem will only be solved with a collective political courage, and I hope that we are at that time now. And I thank you for the ways in which each of you are part of that. For those who are listening, for the ways in which you're advocating, for the ways in which you are providing feedback to us elected officials. The systems that have harmed housing and home ownership for people of color on the north side are the same ones causing the looming eviction crisis. These are interconnected harms because our systems do not work for all of us because they were never designed for all of us. When our laws and policies were initially designed, I mean, we can talk about pre-Civil War in a different kind of way also. When we speak about how much of our country has rests upon exploitation of human life and human labor. And I really, really hope we don't continue what that means in the 2021 cycle. Like, so much of what we're discussing isn't about the humanity in people. It's what we can produce in our labor, what we can produce for the markets. And there's something about that I hope just causes a little pause, regardless of where you end up kind of concluding. That should cause us a little bit of pause with as resource of a country and as resource of a state as we are. I am here because I have the rights I enjoy today because of many, many, many other people from decades ago who I'll never meet who fought for my rights. And so I hope that there are folks on the call who are willing to consider the ways in which we are collectively seeking to expand rights for people we'll never meet decades from now. I'm a kid of immigrants. I should not be in the position I'm in, but I'm here because Black organizers, typically young people, typically Black women, fought for the right to vote. And then, among many things, passed laws that allowed my family to enter this country in ways where I can then go forth and serve in this position. And so I thank the many, 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 many countless people I'll never meet from the decades before. And I hope that people on this call will think about how perhaps decades from now, we won't even think about how the evictions were processed in 2021. And we're hopefully a far more human-centered housing as a fundamental right type of community. That's possible. That's possible if we really, really center ourselves on that kind of outcome. And so I'm hopeful that we have that type of kind of collective will because of the compounding crises. I say this one across the state. Do conditions need to be worse? I mean, do conditions need to be worse than they are right now along lines of health, income, livability, or housing for us to say, all right, what would we design from scratch? I know that that's not how it works, but we should at least think about that, as Michael had stated earlier. And so, yeah, I should step off my soapbox here for a moment because I am walking away a little bit energized hearing the dialogue, particularly from my partner over at the Capitol, because if we are willing to ask it and work for it, and I certainly believe that our residents are deserving of that type of fight from us. So thank you to SD59 for hosting, and thanks to everybody who's been on the call.
Well, I want to thank you to the two elected officials and representative from Homeline for tonight's panel service. And I think this is a very useful conversation. As a person who works professionally in the field, I don't want to get into it too deeply, but I think there was a model during the foreclosure crisis where Hennepin County had 25,000 foreclosures. And the Minnesota Foreclosure Partners Council, I believe, was a good model during that time frame. And I think from that experience, there's a lot of lessons learned from the Great Recession, housing market collapse, that we should be using those lessons learned to avoid mistakes, perhaps that were made at that time, and perhaps lack of public investment to keep people in their homes or residences by previous policymakers. And so I think I'm proud to be affiliated with very progressive, proactive, forward-thinking policymakers today who appear to be making decisions that will really assertively help people and do have a racial equity lens. And so I'm very grateful for the participants tonight and those who attended. Kathleen, you had your hand up? I just want to thank Conrad and Kathleen for arranging this event. And part of our Senate District 59 Outreach and Inclusion series of forums. And so we will continue. Kathleen, do you want to make mention of the census meeting? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, actually, Wendy's on.
Oh, Wendy is, okay.
It's April 21st, but do you want to say something, Wendy?
Yeah, April 21st, and we're going to be having somebody who was in charge of Hennepin County Census, Jill, and she is going to be speaking with two other people which have yet to be secured. But we're going to be talking about census numbers, myths, and facts, and really talking and trying to discern. We're not going to be talking about redistricting or anything like that. It's not going to be a political discussion, but it is going to be who lives in our district and what is really happening in our district versus what people are putting out there for the 2020 census and what we learned.
Excellent. Look forward to it. So with that, we kind of wrap this meeting, and stay well, be safe, mask up Minnesota are usually my closing words on a lot of meetings still. So